This is a suite of videos that goes into more detail around rights. So, as we described in one of the earlier videos, rights generically describe the nature of things that parties, people can do. And under this definition, rights are infinite. But in many respects, rights represent elements of the social contract. All rights are born within a social framework. They represent things that people want to do, and in this instance, things that people want to do with land. So initially, this is amorphous stuff of this infinite array of potential rights that no one's even really thought about, and then they kind of come through into the consciousness, and people start talking about them. And over time, some of these rights start to be framed as being very socially useful and have a legal framework attached to them. And of those rights, even a smaller number become associated with land registration. And so over time, you can see this set of rights evolve as social need evolves. And so registrable rights, or effective registrable rights rather, should represent the underlying social contract. And this is something that has been addressed within the legal framework, and this is Grutter from 1991 that describes law simply not as simply a set of spoken, written, or formalized rules that people blindly follow. Rather, law represents the formalization of behavioral rules about which a high percentage of people agree, that reflect behavioral propensities and that offer potential benefits to those who follow them. So in this respect, law is reflecting societal norms, and those societal norms change over time. And so law must be flexible enough to reflect changes in those social norms. And this is something that has also been talked about by De Soto in the book The Mystery of Capital. And he argues that registrable property rights only work if they're part of an accepted social contract. And this starts to get at the difference between formal and informal approaches to perceptions of land ownership. And so if you don't have a functioning and embraced formal system, then that will decline, because essentially people will turn to an informal system which is more suited to their social needs. And so we need to ensure that the land registration system reflects this social contract. So in order to be acceptable for the land register, a right must be real, i.e. the right must relate to land. It must be enforceable, i.e. the right must be held by a party. It must be registrable, i.e. the right must be legally defined as suitable for the land register. And this means that essentially you will end up pulling together enforceable land rights that are legally appropriate. As we mentioned earlier, under this definition, these right groups are finite, but they might be expressed in infinite ways. There are two main principal categories of registrable right. There's primary right and subordinate right. So primary rights represent rights of ownership. And so rights in land with a legal owner are called primary real rights. Primary real rights become titles in land registers. The principal ownership right, that could be referred to as solum or land or freehold or principal land, is conceptually a container for other rights. So once you own land, you also have the rights to do many other things. So these other rights may not be expressly conveyed, but they are implied because you own this land. And the principal ownership right can contain other primary real rights. So if you own this principal land, you might be able to pull out other forms of ownership from it. In Scotland, these have been formalised and are called separate tenements, and you can separate these rights out from the principal land by either conveyancing. So that's normally where you separate out strata rights for flats or for volumes of space for minerals, or by statute, where you're using laws to legally abstract the ownership of some rights. So that'd be coal, gold, petrochem, those kind of elements. But each of those will be jurisdiction dependent. And here we show the relationship between these rights. So here is our principal land right, and we can have these rights here, which are abstracted using a legal separation. So legally separated ownership rights. So they're not really conceptually part of the principal land anymore, because they've been removed before that principal land is under conveyancing. And then you can separate rights out from that principal land, and that uses traditional conveyancing tools, but it minimizes the number of rights that you can pull out. So it tends to be strata or minerals. But again, all of these are framed by your local jurisdiction, which in this instance is the embracing, formalizing legislation. But then there are other rights that are implied by ownership, and these are called subordinate rights or non-ownership rights. They're inherent in that ownership right and do not require to be expressed when relating to the owner. However, if they are to be held by a third party, then they do need to be expressed. And subordinate rights can be held by these third parties, and they can hold them over land owned by someone else. And these are benefits to the right holding party and encumbrances to the party who owns that affected land. So you're starting to see this kind of rights relationship emerging between the parties who own and the parties who benefit from different right types. So for owning parties, encumbrances are either responsibilities. So both the owner of the land and the right holder can legally enjoy that right, and it is incumbent on the owner of the land to ensure that the right holder can enjoy that right. It is their responsibility. Or they are restrictions. So that's where the owner of the land can no longer enjoy the right. So the right holder can legally enjoy it and can enforce that the landowner does not enjoy that right. And so here we're seeing the other side of that coin in terms of the principal land. Now, these subordinate rights or non-ownership rights can be shared with third parties using conveyancing approaches, conventionally separating them out. Okay, and so this is where we'll deal with leases and securities and life fronts, burdens, servitudes, and easements. So that kind of general set of non-ownership rights, which again are framed within the local jurisdiction. You can also start to group these rights into different sets. So corporal and incorporeal is one example. So you can classify rights based upon their corporeal nature. So corporeal rights represents rights which are physically tangible in terms of land, i.e. they're touchy-feely. And essentially everything which isn't corporeal is by definition incorporeal. It's likely that all non-ownership rights are going to be incorporeal as a rule of thumb. This is what goes on in Scotland, and it seems to follow across all jurisdictions. But it very much depends upon the prominence of corporeality in terms of the rights framework in each jurisdiction as to how important that is. Okay, now we're going to dive in to ownership rights in a little bit more detail in the next section.